Top Bed Talk.
Hi, my name is Sanjeev Agrawal, and I'm the president of a company called LeanTaas. Over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to spend time talking about what is probably one of the biggest questions health systems are facing today, which is how do we manage our operating room capacity and restore elective surgery in a post-COVID world? Specifically, in a world where we have to stay nimble because conditions change week by week, sometimes day by day, and be able to respond to those changes both on the demand side as patients get more comfortable coming back for elective surgeries, as well as on the supply side when it comes to the availability of our ORs, our inpatient beds, and our staff. For any follow-ups, we have set up a special alias called restore@leantaas.com in case you have questions or follow-ups based on what you see, based on the tools and process changes many of our customers are making and the best practices that we discuss. Everything that you're going to see here comes from my and my company's experience working with many health systems across the country. We work with over 100, and of those 100, there are 32 that have deployed our product for operating rooms, which in the pre-COVID world and in the post-COVID world does one thing: help you bin pack your cases during business hours a lot better than without the use of sophisticated mathematics and the tools that we provide. These systems range across EHRs, they range across academic and community, large IDNs, as well as small systems, as you see. And what you're about to see here is the experiences we've had in bringing all of these systems back up online, as well as helping many of them restore elective cases and bring their revenue and profitability back. There are three things we're going to discuss today. First, even in normal times before COVID, managing OR capacity was challenging. Part of it was the absence of tools. The part of it was the absence of sophisticated metrics and reliance on things like block utilization as your metric to right-size block, the availability of data in real time to be able to make changes, the availability of open time as a mix of open and block time, and many of the things that you've heard me talk about in previous EBPOM sessions. However, with COVID having pretty much run a bowling ball through the best laid plans, now we need to think differently in order to stay resilient and agile. So we'll talk about what the impact of COVID has been, not just on the health systems we work with, but on healthcare in the US at large. We've now polled about 400 health systems across the country, most of whom have had to shut their ORs for an extended period of time. So we'll talk about what that impact has been and the heightened need, the exponentially higher need now for the nimbleness and the ability to respond to a constantly changing market. And then finally, we'll get into the tools that exist and some of the techniques and best practices that have been used by the systems we work with on how we look at demand as patients come back and ORs come back online, how we look at supply, the availability of staff, the availability of beds, the availability of rooms, how we match those two to maximize utilization, maximize patient access, maximize surgeon and staff satisfaction within the constraints of what's available to us. And then finally, how we stay nimble enough and measure and monitor things as they go on, because there could be a second shoe that drops. We all hope that COVID goes away permanently, but if it doesn't, and even if it does, there will be times where we'll have to manage the availability of rooms and demand and match them in a much more agile and resilient way. So let's start with the first. The first question of the first topic or the first lesson that we've learned over the last 5 years in working with all these health systems is that the core problem of managing OR capacity boils down to, simply put, an unpredictable demand for ORs, OR time, with an unpredictable supply of all that's needed to bring together to do a surgery. What do I mean by that? If you think about the way block allocation has been traditionally done, there is no such thing as a perfect block allocation. And the reason is that once you give block time away to a surgeon or a group or a service line, in essence, what you're expecting is for that block owner to be able to fill that time well. For a block owner to fill their time well, four things need to come together. the number of patients they see in clinic each week, what percentage of them need surgery done, what percent of them can actually come the day that the block owner has block time, and then the average length of case. And because each of these 4 factors is variable, what ends up happening on the demand side is that the need for OR time, in the best of times, fluctuates in an unpredictable way. What you're seeing on this chart is 4 block owners and how many cases they've done over a 52-week period. So on the x-axis, you see the 52 weeks, and on the y-axis, you see the number of cases. And as you can tell by these different colored lines, sometimes block owners need more time than they have block for, and sometimes they don't need any. And the biggest problem with managing OR capacity well has been the fact that this is not atypical. If I have 100 block owners, all of them have a fluctuating need for time, but we give them permanent allocation of time as if we were assigning carpool lanes to different colored cars. And so the systemic problem is that there is never OR time and there is always OR time. Meaning when I need more time than I have, I don't even know that someone else who has more time than they need will not be using their time well. So this was the problem we solved pre-COVID, and we still solve this problem. It's just been heightened by COVID. And it's the need to fix these issues and be far more agile in the way we allocate capacity, open up capacity, release time, create open time has been exponentially heightened by COVID. So first, let's take a look at what COVID actually did to surgery volumes before we talk about some of the solutions we've seen work. So what we did was when the impact of COVID started to be seen as early as March or April, and many health systems started closing their ORs down, we kept fairly close contact with them. We obviously could see their data in our tools. And what you're seeing is an example of a system on the East Coast and one on the West Coast, and how their elective surgery volumes varied over the last few months. So this graph starts around the beginning of March and goes through the beginning of August. And as you would expect, the pattern is the same. The green is the surgeries that were done. The red is the surgeries that were canceled, and the blue is the surgeries that were scheduled but not performed for a variety of reasons. As you can see, there was a big dip in the April-May period, and then thankfully surgeries have started to come back, and the relative ratios of the scheduled to being the ones that were performed have started to become more pre-COVID-like. Yet almost no system is back fully to its pre-COVID volumes. And some of the reasons have less to do with the availability of ORs and staff and more to do with how comfortable even patients are yet coming back to the ORs. And this, of course, is a huge loss of revenue and profitability for hospitals, given how important the ORs are to the economics of almost every hospital. We did a webinar back in April and another one in May where we polled about 400 hospitals on just how deep the cuts were, how much of their elective surgery they had canceled. And almost 76% of respondents said that they had postponed or canceled more than 80% of their surgeries for an extended period of time, for many, many weeks. So the first big issue obviously is all the backlog that's been built. How do we recapture that as our ORs come back online? And the second big learning we took away was that, frankly, the tools weren't quite there. So one manifestation of that is that only 10% of survey participants were able to capture some of this lost backlog in their EHR. Because a lot of this backlog was on paper notes or was in the lists in the clinics and never actually ended up in a depot or any other kind of backlog that was electronically visible. And these were just symptomatic of the many, many problems that ORs have faced in coming back to their pre-COVID state. And so if you think about what's happened in terms of the three biggest drivers that have influenced how each hospital has recovered from COVID or is in the process of recovering from COVID, there is no one-size-fits-all answer. But there have been three independent factors that have come together. One is clearly legislation, because different states have had varying degrees of executive orders. So if you are in Seattle, if you're in Washington or New York, the significant impact of COVID was felt very early on and for an extended period of time. If you were in a state that was less hit by COVID, let's say South Dakota, you might have seen less of that bite of the apple from your elective surgery volume. But regardless, every state and every hospital has been impacted by how long their ORs have to be shut. The second has to be the unique financial and capacity constraints of each hospital. And so if you think about the number of inpatient beds that hospitals shut down or set aside for COVID dirty volume, as they called it, how many elective surgeries they could do that ended up in an inpatient bed obviously was restricted by the lack of availability of non-COVID beds. Secondly, when you think about the staff that were available and the hit COVID took on their personal lives, on some of the things that made it harder for them to come back to work. And then when they came back, the fact that some staff has to work weekends and nights, which means our staffing profile over the week has to change. Clearly, the availability of ORs itself is not enough. We need to bring together OR staffing, equipment, and so many other things that the capacity constraints have been quite real as a result of that. Finally, one of the biggest issues that COVID and the recovery from COVID has shed its light on is the fact that many of the processes and tools required to recover from COVID just did not exist and still don't exist in many hospitals. Some of the most obvious ones, one I talked about earlier, was the ability to capture backlog electronically and to have visibility into it. Without doing that, how do you prioritize who should get their cases done first when volume comes back? The ability to move block around easily and quickly, have a governance process by which we can either just blow up block for a month or two in case we need to, or change that allocation in a way that makes sense, that actually corresponds to the backlog that's been created, and to react to it. Finally, when the ORs did open up, we found that we went back to our old ways of clinics calling OR scheduling and not having visibility into time availability, the right time availability into the ORs, which was a huge problem pre-COVID, and post-COVID was even more exacerbated because of the need for open time to be created in the ORs. And so some of these missing tools and processes have added to the issues. So what we'll talk about is how a lot of the systems we work with and other best practices that we've seen to react to this situation. So, in order to stay resilient and agile in the post-COVID world, we have found that there are 4 key elements to the answer. The first is to truly understand and prioritize your real demand. There are many calculators floating out there. You can obviously do a back-of-the-envelope calculation on what your pre-COVID volumes were. And so if your ORs were shut for a few weeks, how much of that backlog would have been built? Sort of a size of the breadbox answer. And that's important to know. Did we have to postpone or cancel hundreds of surgeries or thousands of surgeries? So based on our catchment area and where we are, what is the market situation like? But where the rubber really meets the road is, what's the real demand? Meaning, if you take away some of the volume that, for example, people who are not yet comfortable coming back for surgeries, people who've lost their jobs or have for other reasons decided that now is not the time where they can afford getting their surgeries done. The only way to know real demand is to have the ability to capture that backlog in some sort of transparent and visible way across your community of clinics and surgeons. And so one of the biggest problems is how much backlog is truly there. The second is, what is my real surgical capacity? As we all know, my real OR capacity doesn't depend just on the number of rooms I have, or just the number of staff I have, or just the number of inpatient beds I have, but on a combination of all of these things. And so just being able to open rooms isn't good enough. Just being able to open rooms and say we're going to work late during the night or we're going to work on weekends only makes sense if the right equipment and the right staff is available, anesthesia is available, if we need robots and if we need C-arms and if we need all of the other elements that need to come together. And so if you think about lack of visibility into demand, lack of full control over supply, the third element we need to get a handle on is how do we both estimate demand, predict supply, and then match the two? And the two pieces that go into that are, do we blow up our block schedule? Do we have a different block schedule? Do we have a temporary block schedule? And a lot of hospitals have dealt with it differently, as we will see. And then finally, even with a block schedule, life will never behave according to a block schedule. So once we assign block, how do we make it really simple and in the surgeon's and block owner's best interest to release time that they know they're not going to need, to allow others that may have a bigger backlog of cases but not enough block time to be able to do those cases? And when we actually put in the case form or the case request, can we make sure that we triage these cases to make sure that the non-COVID ones hopefully get higher priority and we're able to identify which ones we may want to do first? And then finally, as we prepare for a world which is still quite uncertain, what do we measure? How often do we measure it? How do we see the signs of maybe in some states COVID wave 2 coming back? And how do we prepare for that? It's a rinse and repeat of items 1, 2, and 3. So let's start with the first piece, which is to understand real demand. So there are many such tools out there, and I'll just mention one of them. One of the tools that we built, which is a free tool anybody can use to estimate sort of the size of the backlog, whether it's in the hundreds or the thousands of cases, is available at this URL that you see on the screen, covid19.iq.com/OR volume estimator with hyphens, OR-volume estimator. It happens to work better on Chrome than the experiences on IE. If you go to this site, you'll be able to enter in a handful of inputs, like when you closed your ORs, what was your pre-COVID volume in those ORs, how did you stagger your recovery back, when were 25% of your ORs back online, 50%, 75%, etc. And based on these assumptions, it'll give you a size of the breadbox answer to, is it going to take 3 months, 6 months, or 18 months? And you can vary some of these inputs and say, okay, if I'm willing to work weekends, if I'm willing to work nights, if I'm willing to and have staff to support us outside of business hours, how much can I reduce that period by? And so this has been used by hundreds of hospitals across the country. Again, it's a tool that you should feel free to use to come up with an estimate, no matter where you are in the world. The second and probably more specific and relevant set of tools is around actually getting visibility into the real backlog. And so many organizations have tried to collect this backlog information by hand, through Excel spreadsheets, through emails, through faxes, and they have created the best they can a system of record for what their backlog looks like. Because a lot of these systems that we work with, not all clinics have access to the EHR. Not all clinics even book into the EHR. And so these Excel spreadsheets have come in very handy. Sometimes the issue, though, is that these Excel spreadsheets cannot be updated because they're not real time. They're not in the cloud. Not everyone has access to the spreadsheet. And so there are other tools that have been created. One that we did, which is purely a cloud-based tool that can be changed and where every clinic can have access to it, where every surgeon in every clinic can show who their patients are, how long they've been waiting, what the procedure is, and whether it's a priority 1, 2, or 3, depending on whatever rules you want to put around priority. But this is really important to get to the next level of detail where you understand, okay, I think I have a backlog of 1,000 cases, and now I know the 500 of them that my clinics are telling me. Especially in the community environment where clinics may have access to multiple different hospitals where they can take their cases to, the ability to know the backlog and then to be able to provide to these providers open time or block time that they can put these cases in is obviously of key concern, and we'll talk about that. But step one has to be knowing where the backlog is, how much there is, and of what relative priority there is. And then being able to look at each of these and to be able to create some method in the madness, to be able to sequence these cases and say, do we do all the priority ones first? Do we give block time to people that have a certain number of high priority cases and a lot of open time to those that have mostly P2 and P3 cases, but are high volume enough, high revenue enough, high profitability enough? So again, if you'd like more information about these tools, please feel free to write to restore@leantaas.com, and we'd be happy to show you how multiple hospitals are using these tools. There is an additional tool of pushing these cases back into the EHR, which is also very relevant to systems that currently don't have their clinics that are already writing into the EHR, and a majority of the systems we work with are in that position. So that's part one. What is high level? Size of a bread box, the size of my backlog, and then specifically which clinics have how much and of what priority. The second piece to the puzzle is truly understanding what we call our real surgical capacity. And the way we express that is the constraints to your ORs. So the fact that we have 10 physical rooms is important, but is not the only factor. The other big factors, of course, are equipment, staff, and inpatient beds. We found in the early days of COVID, because so much of the inpatient bed capacity in so many hospitals was just being kept aside, if you did more surgical cases than the remainder of the beds that were available for outside of ED and COVID dirty volume, you suddenly had this issue of patients waiting a long time before they could be bedded. Pretty obvious thing, but working as a team and cutting across the OR and beds space in hospitals has become really important. So, for example, if we just start with what we call OR constraints, the most obvious ones are how many of our ORs can we bring online, both from what the state's allowing, plus our ability to actually man and staff them. Second is, given that there is such a backlog built, as we talked about before, how do we deal with block time? How do we create the right mix of block time for people that will actually use the time well, and then enough open time and visibility into that open time so the ad hoc volume can be brought in, where we don't really need a full block every week for a surgeon, but they may have enough case volume to fill 2 or 3 blocks worth of time over the next month. Can we open up more rooms, including maybe using some of the procedure rooms and ASC rooms, or divert traffic for outpatient cases to the ASCs? Again, doing this by hand and manually is extremely difficult, which is why some of the tools we're going to show you in a second really have made a big difference. And then, of course, do we have the ability to extend business hours, both during the work week as well as during weekends? And how limited are we in our availability of supplies and staff in order to man those rooms and actually get cases done? The biggest and most obvious constraint, of course, is our specialized staffing, our RNs, our techs, and our anesthesiologists, since that's a zero-sum game. And many of them have had to be furloughed during the COVID period because hospitals couldn't afford them. And as we bring them back, how available are they based on their own personal lives and their ability to come back for a 40-hour week or a 30-hour week or longer? Of course, the entire supply chain of pharmaceuticals and the equipment we need and the consumables we need during surgeries, and how do we plan that with our pharmaceutical vendor partners? And then SPD, the availability of the number of PACUs we have, all plays a big role. So understanding these constraints and codifying them, so when we create open time, the right room and the right slot of time is available to the right clinic is really, really important. Now, of course, in parallel, there are all the inpatient constraints we talked about, which is by day of week, by hour of day, how many units are available with the kinds of specialized staff we need to take care of orthotrauma patients or neurosurgery patients, were we to do those cases. And so how do we only do enough cases of a certain service line that we can actually take care of post-fac and admit into our ORs? There are many beds, as we talked about before, that were taken off the grid for both COVID-19 and ED and trauma patients. And then, of course, many hospitals ended up creating pools of units in order to expand their inpatient capacity for a certain type of patient. And so create these sister units that were created and pooled together so we could co-locate either COVID patients or non-COVID patients, meant that now the way our inpatient bed capacity looked was different than it did pre-COVID, and we couldn't just assume that the same number of beds were available. So our degree of flexibility in how many transfers we could bring within a hospital or across hospitals, should we have a network of hospitals, all played a big role in planning how many elective surgeries we could do with the constraints of the inpatient beds we had. And then, of course, the need to manage LOS was never higher, because if we could actually discharge patients safely earlier in the day, we could do more cases, and we still can do more cases if we're managing the dynamics of discharge the way we'd like to. To help with these constraints, we as a company created many other free tools that you also still have access to. In this presentation, we've linked a couple of these tools. Like I said before, if you email us, we're happy to send these free tools to you. One that is worth talking about is to take a survey across various types of specialized staffing resources you might have, asking people for their availability, both during business hours and on weekends and outside of business hours. So you really have a fact-based, data-driven sense of what real staffing is available to you. A very similar tool is to bottom up, by OR, by procedure room, look at when you want to run it, how many hours a day do you want to operate it, and then identify the type of resources you need, both from an anesthesia and a specialized staffing perspective, and see if, based on the results of these surveys, you can actually staff the rooms you want to staff. How much time can you actually add outside of business hours? How many more FTEs do you need? Do you need to call on travelers or hire more nurses as these surgeries come back? And so what's a realistic estimate of the total number of cases you can actually get done? Again, if you'd like access to these tools, please email us at restore@leantaas.com, and we'd be happy to send these to you whenever you're ready. So now, let's move on to how we match this variable uncertain backlog with this variable uncertain supply of ORs and equipment and nurses. And there are two pieces to it. Let's start first by talking about what we have seen within the ORs that we work with. Clearly, the big goal of however we end up managing capacity is to pack our ORs best we can. So we maximize utilization, create maximum patient access, help patients get the surgeries that they have pushed back for this COVID period. And we've observed a multitude of practices. Almost everybody is running a different version of their block schedule post-COVID than pre-COVID. Some of them have consolidated, some of them have broken it by service line, or some of them have actually unpacked their schedules and made a lot more open time available, which is actually great, given that the uncertainty in who needs how much time is pretty high. Some have created a phased recovery plan, saying, let's take our pre-COVID block schedule and collapse it and maybe have half of it running for the next 2 or 3 months until we have a more stable block schedule, depending on how whether COVID comes back or not. Some have decided to take this opportunity to consolidate service lines or groups or individuals and create service line blocks, which has its pluses and its minuses because it takes away accountability from individual block owners, but might be easier to manage if you let the service line do their own prioritization, and we can spend more time on that. And then there are others that have actually taken the radical step of blowing up a majority of their block schedule and just create open time and visibility into open time, almost like open table for open time, which we'll also talk about in a minute. Our best recommendation is to actually have a mix of open and block time. And if you do have block time, have a mix of service line and individual block. Again, happy to talk more about this, but these practices we've seen vary from hospital to hospital. In order to better catch up with the backlog, we think that the number of rooms you run, how you divert some capacity to the ASCs that you have, maybe include them in the overall capacity planning, figure out whether you're going to isolate a certain number of ORs to take care of COVID dirty versus COVID clean patients, are all factors that go into the algorithms we use. And then finally, of course, one big thing that'll help you almost immediately is to increase your auto release time. So if it used to be 3 days or 4 days, make it 7 days or 10 days, which, given the backlog, shouldn't be that hard for any individual block owner or service line to manage, because there are so many cases pending. If a block is completely empty 7 or 10 days before day of, it might be a good time to take it away, at least temporarily, and change that policy. So most of these practices will work if you have the right governance structures and the right tools behind them, and we've seen a variety of them. And our recommendation would be the right mix of block and open time. Figure out what your real number of rooms, including ASCs and procedure rooms, are, at least temporarily. Increase the auto release time, and consider not running to full capacity, because if you're planning to run weekends and after hours, it'll be very difficult to staff and get equipment for. Now, let's talk a little bit about this notion of the flexibility of creating more open time and the benefits of that. In a world where dozens, if not hundreds, of clinics and block owners have pent-up demand, if you are too strict about creating a block schedule and are too heavily blocked, we're going to have this issue of many of these blocks will not go used as well as you'd like. And so one of the things we recommend highly is to make it really easy to release block, really easy to show that open time and the right open time to the right clinic with the constraints of the type of staff and equipment that they need. And so, again, happy to get into details about this, but the tools that we provide and other people provide that you may want to take a look at are the ones that predict who is not going to use their time well into the future, ping those clinics with automated alerts to encourage them to release time, create a pool of open time that all clinics can have access to, and put the right constraints of equipment and staff to be able to show the right open time to the right clinic, so they can request that time and keep the control of approving and denying that time in the hands of the OR. We call this open table for open time, and it works as a release valve to the fact that not all block time, if you are too heavily blocked, you will run into this issue of some of these blocks will not be used as well as you'd like. The way to encourage that, to get away from your OR schedulers having to call all these clinics or all the phones and faxes and post-it notes that usually go around, is to actually provide an open table-like tool. So when a ping goes out to a certain clinic saying, hey, you have time 10 days from now, we don't see you having a single case in the grid, would you consider releasing that time? If you allow your clinics to be able to release that time through one click on a mobile phone or on the web, instead of having to wait for business hours and to speak to an OR scheduler, you will find a lot more efficiency. Much like what, say, eBay did to garage sales or Kayak did to travel reservations, by distributing the ability for people to self-serve, release and request open time, a lot more open time can be opened up a lot sooner. Similarly, once you have, and by the way, this block can be released to general open time, or it can be released to the specific service line that individual belongs to, because especially as for those hospitals that are mainly organized in service line blocks, maintaining that accountability will require that we be able to play well within our own service line and across service lines as well. Happy to show you again some of these tools if you email us at restore@leantaas.com. And then the flip side, which is make it really simple for clinics to be able to see this open time and to be able to request it as simply as they might be requesting a table for dinner. And when you surface that time, make sure that the time actually makes sense. A simple example is if you're able to only do 3 or support 3 neurosurgeries at once, but have enough staffing to support 5 or 6 orthopedic surgeries, clearly you want to show more open time, and the right open time being available to the orthopedic service line than to neurosurgery, because by definition, the time itself doesn't really solve the problem. Being able to provide the room, the staff, anesthesia, and all the supporting equipment around it matters. And so the more you take all this algebra outside of people's heads and manual practices and actually codify them into tools, the easier it is for you. Also, one of the biggest things that has worked really well during this period in the work we've done with hospitals is when open time is at a premium, being able to show for days where time isn't available, the ability to put your name on an Amazon wish list, the ability to say, hey, if time does open up on a certain day, please let me know. And again, automating this process instead of, again, people calling or emailing or faxing OR availability, just distribute that open time availability to everybody. Also, while you're requesting open time, to also be able to triage and get some information about the patient that's going into the OR or for whom the time is being requested, so you can make sure that if this patient seems to have COVID-like symptoms, you take care of them specially with the PPE that's required, with the kind of staffing that's required to take care of them. And so, if your tools allow you to triage cases where there's a configurable workflow when requesting time and putting a case in, so you can ask the right questions that give you a sense for, is this the type of case that we will allow? Is it high priority enough that it needs to be done, or can it wait? So then when OR schedulers get this request, they're able to look at the full set of facts, not just the availability of rooms, equipment, and staff, but now also looking at it from a patient's perspective and saying, if this is a non-urgent surgery and it's highly likely this patient has COVID symptoms, I still want to do this because it's a really, really high priority and it's a matter of life and death, versus maybe we can wait a couple of weeks until the symptoms die down. So these are some of the tools that have really come in handy. Being able to have a logical selection of block, being able to create more open time, and between those two, being able to maximize access and bin pack your ORs during business hours or on weekends. And then finally, there's this notion of being prepared for the unknown unknowns. And so being able to see how your volumes are fluctuating week by week, to be able to change block allocation or open time, that mix between those two, if you're finding that our initial guess of how to provide that block time wasn't actually working. So this nimbleness of your tools and to be able to change things more on the fly than we are used to is a big deal. And so every few weeks going back and rinsing and repeating the logic of what's the real backlog? Are we actually getting changes to the original backlog that we started with? We made some assumptions about how many cases we can actually accommodate. Did we accommodate those cases? In giving up permanent block to people, to service lines and to surgeons, we made certain assumptions about future volume they were going to bring in. Did that happen? Are we using our prime time well? Are we overtaxing our staff? Anesthesia, our RNs, our techs? Are we getting into a stage where this is not a sustainable way of continuing to operate? How is staff morale doing? As a result of this is one of the biggest human elements that will limit us and our future going forward if we're not constantly on top of the mix of different things that make surgery successful. One of the biggest ones, of course, is if our staff is feeling good about these changes and is able to actually continue with these changes given the high pressure environment that we're seeing in a lot of systems. And if we need to, take the answers to these questions and rerun the strategy. Look at your backlog, look at your block allocation, look at your the policy for auto release, and change them again. Maybe we need to run slightly fewer rooms. Maybe we only run every other Saturday instead of every other Saturday. These are all real tools in your armory that you can play with as we try and make sure that our patients get the right access, our surgeons get the right access to the OR. And then finally, of course, no one can predict when the vaccine will be available quite yet. If and when the vaccine is available, how long will it take for us to all get immune to the point where we get back to where we were in January of 2020? So in preparing for the next wave, there's a lot we can learn from previous such epidemics. This is a chart of the 1918-1919 pandemic where there were 3 different waves. We all hope that this doesn't happen, but if the next wave does happen, we don't know if it's going to be a bigger or a smaller wave. And so some of these tools that you just saw and some of this way of thinking of understanding demand, understanding supply, matching demand and supply is going to be the answer no matter what happens. Whether there is a second wave, whether it's bigger, whether it's smaller, or even if there isn't. By putting these best practices of being agile and resilient, we can squeeze the maximum amount of juice out of our ORs, create greater patient access, lower unit cost, maximize patient and surgeon satisfaction, nurse and staff satisfaction, as well as increase the health of our hospitals' economics. So with that, hopefully you found some of this useful. I know there's a Q&A session after this that I'm looking forward to participating in. Just to finally repeat one more time, we are really passionate about working with institutions like yours to help. Whether you want to use our tools or not, if you just want to learn more about what other systems are doing. As you saw, we work with many, many health systems across the country. We'd be happy to connect you to some of them as well. All you need to do is email us at restore@leantaas.com. Thank you again for your time, and we're big believers in better healthcare through math. Looking forward to working with you.
Top Med Talk. Thanks for downloading Top Med Talk. Don't forget to subscribe via your podcatcher. Don't forget to check us out on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And also, don't forget, Top Med Talk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that. If you check out ebpom.org, you can find low prices on some of the conferences we're organising around the world. Many of them are virtual and don't even involve you leaving your own home. Check out ebpom.org now.